Summer 1943. The sun hung low over the Russian steppe, a haze of golden light spilling across fields scarred by shellfire and blackened husks of wheat. The air tasted of dust and cordite, and from a distance, the silhouettes of German Tiger tanks loomed like ancient beasts against the horizon. To the soldiers who faced them, these machines were not simply weapons. They were legends in steel, fortresses on treads, engines that seemed to roar with the inevitability of death itself. Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt sat inside his Tiger, the dull rumble of the Maybach engine thrumming through his bones. He was a man of 36, the lines of fatigue carved into his face deeper than the medals on his uniform could erase. He had fought through France, through the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, and now, in the summer heat, he wondered if his luck would endure. His crew, boys more than men, looked to him for certainty, for that quiet voice that steadied hands when shells shrieked overhead. And though he gave them confidence with a firm nod and clipped command, in the silence between battles, doubts gnawed at him. Even iron could break. Beside him crouched Gefreiter Otto Baumann, the gunner, just 23 and full of reckless laughter. Otto had grown up hunting deer in Bavaria, and he still spoke of tanks as though they were rifles, sights, triggers, clean kills. To him, each Allied machine was little more than another stag to be brought down, its armor just another hide to pierce. He relished the Tiger's massive 88mm cannon as though it were an extension of his own ambition. When he grinned, which was often, Reinhardt wondered if the boy saw the war as a game. It was not a comforting thought. Far away, across an ocean, another man leaned over blueprints and models in Detroit. Captain John Jack Reynolds was not yet on the battlefield but already marked by it. A West Point graduate, he had a mind like sharpened steel and a tongue quick with sarcasm. He distrusted the higher brass, especially the kind who made decisions from polished desks rather than muddy trenches. Jack had trained on Shermans, those so-called Ronsons, that Allied crews joked would light up at the first strike. He had seen one burn, had heard the screams of men turned into ash inside their tin can armor. From that moment, he had sworn to survive long enough to command something better. He believed in machines that could stand toe-to-toe with the giants of Germany. In Detroit's factories, another story was taking shape. Sergeant William Bill Carter, lean and grease-stained, tested tank components long before he would fire them in anger. He was a Detroit boy through and through, son of an auto worker, and he never lost the knack for joking even when covered in oil. He called tanks just Fords with cannons, and claimed he could fix one with a wrench and a curse. But behind the humor lay a raw hunger. Bill wanted payback for friends lost in Shermans that never had a chance. He wanted to put his hands on a machine that didn't just carry men to their deaths but gave them a fighting shot at life. While Bill dreamed and Jack doubted, Reinhardt's Tiger moved steadily through the Kursk battlefield, where the largest tank clash in history unfolded. Over 6,000 machines clashed across rolling hills, the air alive with firestorms. German Tigers cut through Soviet armor like scythes through grass, entire companies reduced to wreckage in hours. The Tiger's armor, thick as a bank vault, turned aside most Soviet shells. Its gun reached across fields like a hunter's gaze, punching holes through steel at distances the enemy could hardly imagine. The statistics were terrifying. A Tiger could destroy 10 enemy tanks before it even risked being hit. From above, the battlefield was a sea of smoke and steel carcasses, the air thick with the stench of burning fuel and flesh. To German crews, it felt like proof that their Tiger was eternal, that no machine could rival its dominion. They joked grimly over rations. A Tiger fears nothing but another Tiger. Yet even as the myth deepened, a quiet truth whispered in the background. Invincibility in war never lasted. Reinhardt sensed it though he said nothing. Otto did not. He only boasted of shots fired and kills tallied, as if the war were a scoreboard. The Americans, watching from afar, knew they were outmatched. The Sherman, reliable and numerous, was a war mule, not a war horse. It could be produced in the thousands, but against the Tiger, it was hopeless. Men joked that its only advantage was that when it caught fire, at least there were plenty more waiting in the queue. Jack Reynolds listened to such jokes with a bitter smile, but in the pit of his stomach, rage coiled. Sending boys into Shermans against Tigers was like asking them to charge knights with pitchforks. Yet out of that frustration came a spark. Engineers whispered of something new, a design that could rival the beasts of Germany. The name floated around with the weight of prophecy, the Pershing. To most it was still rumor, a dream on drawing boards. To Jack it became a lifeline. To Bill it was destiny waiting in steel. And though Reinhardt knew nothing of it yet, somewhere deep inside, he felt the winds shifting, as though history itself were preparing a cruel joke at the expense of his beloved Tiger. The summer dragged on, and with it, the war of attrition. Kursk proved bloody even in victory. The Tigers roared, but the Soviets endured, throwing bodies and steel into the grinder. Reinhardt's crew celebrated victories but buried friends just as quickly. He began to write shorter letters home, as if words themselves could no longer shield his wife from the truth. Otto still laughed, still compared kills to deer on a hillside, but in his eyes flickered something darker, something less certain. The myth of the tiger was glorious, but even myths left shadows. Back in America, Bill Carter stood on a factory floor, wiping grease from his palms, staring at the curved armor of a prototype tank. He grinned, though his grin carried something sharp. "Looks like this Ford finally grew teeth," he muttered. Jack Reynolds, watching trials, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The Pershing was real. The question now was whether it would arrive in time to matter. The war was far from decided. For now, the Tiger still ruled Europe's fields, its shadow stretching across the continent. Men like Klaus Reinhardt clung to it as the last proof of Germany's strength, while men like Jack Reynolds cursed its name and prayed for something that could match it. Bill Carter waited with restless hands and the hope of vengeance. The steppe was quiet for a moment, broken only by the distant thunder of engines. In the stillness, the Tigers stood like monuments of war, unshaken, unbroken, their barrels sweeping the horizon. But far across the ocean, in the factories where sparks flew like stars, something new was being forged. Something the German crews had never imagined. Something that would shatter not only steel but the myths they lived by. And when it came, it would roar with a voice louder than the Tigers. The summer of 1943 ended with the Tiger still a god of war, but gods, as history always reminds us, do not last forever. In the winter of 1943, while the Tigers prowled across Europe like armored kings, the Americans wrestled with their own bitter truth. The Sherman, dependable and easy to churn out in rivers of steel, had proven itself a mule of war. It hauled men, it advanced across muddy fields, it fought when ordered. But against the Tiger, the Sherman was little more than tinder. Crews spoke of them with the gallows humor of men who knew the odds. "She's a Ronson," they'd say, striking a match for effect. "Lights up the first time." For every joke, there were boys who never came home, their tanks burning like funeral pyres across hedgerows and villages. Captain John Jack Reynolds had seen enough. At 28, he wore his officer's insignia like a burden rather than a badge. West Point had given him discipline, but the war had given him contempt for the polished men who sent others to die in machines they would never ride. He walked factory floors in Detroit with a sour expression, eyes running over rows of Shermans destined for Europe, each one a coffin waiting for a crew. He remembered the cries in North Africa, the sound of shells punching through armor like paper, the desperate scramble to escape flames. It was a memory that refused to loosen its grip. He carried it like a stone in his chest, and every time a general praised the Sherman as good enough, the stone grew heavier. Sergeant William Bill Carter saw the world differently. Where Jack saw betrayal, Bill saw unfinished work. At 22, lean and wiry, he had grown up with the hum of engines in his ears, the son of a Detroit mechanic who lived and died by the rhythm of pistons. Bill knew how machines spoke, how they rattled, how they coughed, how they sang. He could coax life from engines others declared dead, patch armor with bolts and curses, and still find room for a joke. When he first laid eyes on the hulking shape of the new prototype, he whistled low and muttered, "Now that's a Ford with teeth." The machine before him was no Sherman. It was broader, lower, its armor sloped like the shoulders of a prizefighter. And at its heart lay the 90mm cannon, a weapon that looked less like a gun and more like a promise. Engineers called it the T-26, but the name whispered on the floor was Pershing, in honor of the general who had led American forces in the last Great War. Where the Sherman was a mule, this one was a wolf. Frank Donovan, one of Chrysler's chief engineers, stood by with arms crossed, watching Bill circle the machine like a farmer inspecting a thoroughbred. Donovan was a man of middle years, spectacles fogged from the heat of the factory, and though he had never stood in a tank under fire, his pride in the Pershing was palpable. "She'll kill a tiger at 1,000 yards, he said matter-of-factly as if quoting scripture. "Tested her myself against a captured panther. Armor went through like butter." Jack raised an eyebrow, skeptical but curious. "That's what they said about the last one. Until men had to ride it." Donovan didn't flinch. "This isn't the last one, Captain. This is the answer." Still, answers in war rarely came quick. Pershings required resources, and resources required approval, and approval came from men who thought in numbers rather than blood. Generals argued that the Sherman's strength lay not in one machine but in many. Why build 100 wolves when you could field 1,000 mules? The math of war was cruel, and in the meantime American boys burned. Jack cursed the arithmetic every chance he got, but his words carried little weight in the smoky rooms of Washington. Bill cared less about the politics and more about the machine itself. He spent hours crawling over it, tracing fingers along its sloped armor, testing the recoil of the 90mm, listening to the purr of its engine as though it were a living thing. At night, when the factory quieted and sparks died on the assembly line, he'd linger, watching the Pershing rest under the dim lamps, as if it were waiting to be unleashed. When news from Europe reached Detroit, it arrived in telegrams and headlines that stung like wasp bites. Salerno, Normandy. Each story carried the same refrain: Sherman sacrificed by the dozen, men roasted alive, tigers still feared. Jack read each one with clenched fists, muttering to Bill, "We're losing boys to bureaucracy, not bullets." Bill would grin, wipe his hands, and reply, "Then let's build her faster." It wasn't only Americans who sensed the shift. German intelligence intercepted rumors of a new Allied tank, though details were scarce. To Klaus Reinhardt, still guiding his Tiger across the Eastern Front, the whispers sounded like fairy tales. The Sherman was laughable. The Pershing, if it existed, would arrive too late. Yet a voice in the back of his mind wondered if history might be preparing its next cruel twist. Even Otto Baumann, the gunner who once laughed at everything, grew quieter. He had seen the Tiger's armor cracked once by Soviet guns at close range, and the memory lingered like a hairline fracture in his confidence. Back in Detroit, Donovan staged trials before officers flown in from Washington. A Panther's captured carcass stood as the target, its armor pockmarked from previous tests. Engineers loaded the Pershing's 90mm, and the shot rang out with a thunderous crack. The round struck true, tearing through the German steel and blasting daylight out the far side. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Even the skeptics shifted in their seats. Bill smirked, dusting soot from his uniform. Jack allowed himself the faintest grin. Yet victory in trials was not victory in war. Production would take time. Politics would take longer. Men would still die in Shermans while Pershings crawled from factories one by one. That night, Jack sat at his desk, pen hovering over paper, drafting another report that would likely be shelved with the rest. He thought of boys whose names he'd never know, whose last moments would be fire and smoke. He thought of Klaus Reinhardt somewhere out there, sitting inside his Tiger, smug in his belief of invincibility. The thought sharpened his resolve. He would push, argue, demand, anything to get the Pershing into the field. Bill meanwhile tightened bolts and tested systems, humming as he worked. He had no patience for politics. He believed in the machine, in steel and fire. Every adjustment he made felt like setting a trap for a predator, the kind his father once warned him about in the woods. You wait, you bait, and when it comes close enough, you strike. The Tiger was that predator. The Pershing would be the hunter waiting in the brush. By the time the first Pershing shipped out for Europe, the snow was falling on the Ardennes and German tanks were carving their last great offensive. The Tigers still thundered, still struck fear, but their days of unchallenged dominance were numbered. The Americans had finally forged something that could meet them head-on. The men who would ride it, Jack, bitter but determined, Bill, eager with a mechanic's confidence, were ready to write the next chapter. In the factories, sparks flew like constellations, each one a tiny promise that steel could answer steel. And though no German tanker yet knew it, the myth of invincibility was already cracking. The Pershing was coming, and when it arrived, it would not whisper. It would roar. The winter of 1944 pressed down on Europe like a clenched fist, its snows muffling the sounds of villages already broken by years of war. The Ardennes forests were skeletal and silent, hiding within them the rumble of engines that would soon shake the ground. German armor, desperate yet still formidable, prowled the countryside like wolves unwilling to surrender their territory. Tigers rolled through frost and smoke, their crews hardened by loss yet clinging to faith in the beast that had carried them this far. On the other side of the front, new machines crossed the channel under canvas covers, their names spoken in hushed tones by Allied soldiers who prayed for a miracle. The Pershing had arrived. Captain John Reynolds felt the weight of that miracle the first time he climbed into the commander's hatch of his T-26E3. The cold air smelled of grease and snow, of men's sweat trapped in heavy coats. Beneath him, Sergeant Bill Carter ran his hands over the 90mm gun like a craftsman touching a prized instrument. Bill's grin was unshakable even in the bitter cold. "Feels like she's waiting for a song," he said, patting the breech. Jack gave a thin smile, though his thoughts ran darker. He had no interest in songs. He wanted vengeance, and he wanted proof that all the sacrifices that had led them here had not been wasted. Across the lines, Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt guided his Tiger through the white streets of a ruined Belgian town. Snow fell in thick flakes, muffling the growl of the Maybach engine. To him, the war felt like a long corridor growing narrower with every month, yet inside the Tiger's armor he still found reassurance. The steel was thick, the gun steady, the myth of invincibility clinging like incense to a church's stone walls. Gefreiter Otto Baumann, eyes bright with cold, loaded shells with practiced rhythm. He was older now, only in years but not in spirit, still eager for the duel, still dreaming of glory though Reinhardt could see the cracks. The boy's laughter came less often. Fear had taken a seat beside him, though neither spoke of it. When the clash came, it did so not with the thunder of great armies but with the intimacy of a duel. Cologne, March 1945. The city lay in ruins, its cathedral spires jagged against a gray sky, its streets littered with rubble and ash. Civilians watched from shattered windows as two titans of steel moved into the open. A panther lurked at an intersection, its crew confident, its gun angled like the finger of a god. Jack spotted it first, his breath fogging against his goggles. "Bill, give her the truth," he said softly. Carter locked the sights, the crosshairs steady despite the pounding of his heart. He squeezed and the 90mm roared. The shot tore through stone dust and silence, slamming into the panther with a blast that lit the ruins like lightning. The German machine erupted in fire, flames spilling into the cold air as its crew clawed desperately at hatches that would not open. Civilians gasped, their myth of German steel crumbling in front of their eyes. For Bill, the moment was electric, his grin fierce as he pulled back from the sight. "Told you she had a song." For Jack it was something heavier. He watched the panther burn and thought of every Sherman lost before this day, every boy who might have lived had this gun been forged earlier. The victory tasted of ash even as it proved the Pershing's worth. Klaus Reinhardt heard of the Cologne battle days later. The story passed from one crew to another like a rumor too dangerous to believe. A German tank destroyed by an American machine at range? The thought was unthinkable. Yet when he looked at Otto, who no longer smiled so easily, he knew belief was not the issue. The myth of the Tiger was beginning to rot. Still, pride held him fast. "Until I see one with my own eyes," he muttered, "the Tiger bows to none." He would see one soon enough. Ruhr Valley, April 1945. Smoke clung to the narrow streets as German armor pulled back, cornered by advancing Allied forces. Reinhardt's Tiger crept forward, barrel sweeping alleys like a watchful eye. Around a corner, the Pershing waited, its crew silent, hearts pounding. Jack peered through his optics, saw the massive form moving through the mist, its stripes of camouflage like the hide of some ancient predator. He felt the weight of history in that instant, man against myth, steel against steel. "Bill," he whispered. "Steady now." The first exchange was thunder. Reinhardt's 88mm barked, the shell shrieking past brick and stone, missing by inches. Carter's hands were calm as he returned fire. The 90mm struck, armor cracking like glass under a hammer. The Tiger lurched, smoke trailing from its side, yet still it advanced. Otto reloaded frantically, sweat freezing on his brow. Reinhardt gritted his teeth, muttering prayers in German. Another shot, another roar, another impact. This time, the Tiger groaned as though alive, fire spilling from its engine deck. Otto's hands trembled. Reinhardt gave the order to abandon, his voice breaking for the first time in years. The German crew scrambled into the open, snow soaking their boots, flames at their backs. Jack watched through his periscope, eyes hard, lips pressed thin. He could have fired again, could have ended it, but he lowered his hand. Bill said nothing, just exhaled, the tension leaving him like air from a punctured tire. The Tiger burned behind its crew, its myth dissolving into black smoke that rose into the April sky. For Reinhardt, the sight was a funeral. The Tiger, once a god, now lay as a carcass in the street. For Jack, it was vindication, but it carried no joy. He thought of how many might have lived if this moment had come 2 years earlier. Bill, ever the mechanic, watched the fire with quiet satisfaction. "Guess the wolf finally found its prey," he murmured. The battle ended not with cheers but with silence. The townspeople emerged from ruins to stare at the burning giant, its aura of fear stripped away. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, cracked but still defiant. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him, then ordered the Pershing forward. The war was not yet over, but in that street, in that clash of steel, something had shifted forever. The Tiger was mortal. The Pershing had proved it. And as smoke curled upward into the gray sky, the men who had witnessed it knew they had stood at the turning of an age. The myth of the tiger had lived too long in whispers, passed through camps like a fire in dry grass. Men spoke of it as though it were invincible, a beast wrought from steel and shadow, against which no allied machine could stand. But in the dying weeks of the war, as the Pershings rolled eastward with their long barrels cutting through the mist, the old stories began to fracture. Fear and awe, once belonging only to the German giants, now turned uncertain, brittle, as if waiting for a hammer blow to finish the work. Captain John Reynolds felt the weight of that change in every mile they advanced. His Pershing moved at the head of a column through ravaged German countryside, its 90mm gun like a challenge carved against the horizon. Inside the tank, Sergeant Bill Carter never stopped fussing over the breech, his hands busy even when there was no need. "She's more than a tank," he said in one of his rare quiet moments. "She's the answer." But Reynolds, staring through the commander's cupola, knew answers never came so clean. He thought of the boys still buried inside Sherman scattered across Normandy fields, and the bitterness clung to him like frost on his coat. On the far side of the River Ruhr, Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt watched smoke curl from factories that no longer belonged to Germany. His Tiger stood idle, its yellow-gray armor streaked with soot. Around him, what remained of his crew sat in silence. Otto Baumann, once eager, now carried the face of an old man though his years had not yet reached 20. "They say the Americans have a new tank," Otto muttered, his voice cracking with the effort. "Bigger gun. Stronger armor." Reinhardt said nothing at first, only placed his gloved hand on the cold steel of the 88mm. "Myths do not die so easily," he finally replied, though the words tasted of ash in his mouth. He had seen too many comrades vanish in burning hulks, too many gods brought low by fire. Yet pride, stubborn as bone, kept him tethered to the Tiger's shadow. The two machines met in the ruins of a German village in April, where narrow streets funneled steel into inevitable collision. The air was thick with the smell of brick dust and wet earth, the quiet broken only by the distant crack of artillery. Reynolds guided his Pershing forward, every nerve alert. He sensed the ambush before he saw it, the faint shimmer of camouflage, the unnatural silence of a street where no children played, no civilians moved. Then the Tiger emerged from behind a collapsed house, its barrel swinging like the eye of some ancient predator. "Contact front," Reynolds barked. Carter had already swung the gun, his voice steady though sweat trickled down his temple. The first German shell screamed past, tearing masonry into dust. Carter fired in reply, the 90mm punching a hole into the Tiger's flank. The beast shuddered but did not fall. Reinhardt snarled, barking orders, Otto ramming another round into the breach with frantic urgency. Their second shot slammed into the Pershing's glacis, sparks showering the crew inside. For a breathless moment Reynolds thought they were done. Then he felt the armor hold. The Pershing had endured. The duel narrowed into a heartbeat rhythm. Fire, reload, fire again. Each blast echoed like judgment in the stone ruins. Carter's second strike found the Tiger's track, freezing the machine in place. But Reinhardt would not surrender. Trapped yet unbroken, he fired again, the recoil slamming through the hull, the shell grazing the Pershing's side in a shriek of tortured metal. Otto's hands bled on the shells, his body shaking with exhaustion. The smell of cordite clung to his lungs, but still he obeyed, still he loaded. Reinhardt's faith, his pride, demanded it. Inside the Pershing the air was thick with smoke. Reynolds felt time itself tighten, each second stretched thin. He thought of Carter, hunched over the breach with the stubborn fire of a man who refused defeat. He thought of the boys watching them from behind, infantrymen who had pinned their hope on this duel, who would measure their chances by its outcome. And he thought of the myth, of the shadow that had haunted them since the first Tigers appeared on eastern roads. This was more than steel against steel. It was the breaking of chains. "Finish it," Reynolds said, his voice calm, almost weary. Carter fired. The 90mm roared with finality, the shell smashing into the Tiger's turret ring. Steel split, flames rushed out, the machine groaned like a dying animal. Reinhardt's ears rang as the fire licked his face, the world collapsing around him in smoke and heat. He gave the order to abandon, but even as Otto scrambled for the hatch, the boy's eyes wide with terror, Reinhardt lingered. He laid his hand once more on the 88mm, whispering something that only the flames heard, before following his crew into the broken street. The Tiger burned. Its myth, once untouchable, now lay in ruin for all to see. Civilians peeked from cellars, their faces pale in the firelight, watching as the beast collapsed into ash. Soldiers who had feared it for years felt a strange stillness wash over them, as though a great weight had finally been lifted from their shoulders. Reynolds stood in his hatch, the glow of the flames reflecting in his eyes. He did not cheer. He did not smile. He simply watched, silent and steady, until the last of the fire consumed the tiger's shape. Beside him, Carter exhaled a long breath and muttered, "So much for invincible." But Reynolds said nothing. In his heart, he knew they had killed more than a machine that day. They had shattered the last illusion holding the enemy's pride together. For Reinhardt, crawling from the wreckage, the loss felt like the closing of a chapter, the ending of a world where German steel ruled unchallenged. For Reynolds, it felt like vindication, bitter, yes, but necessary. And for every man who watched the tiger fall, it marked the passing of an era, the proof that no myth could withstand the truth forever. The fire burned until night swallowed the sky, its embers casting long shadows across the village. Those who witnessed it would carry the memory until their dying days. The tiger was mortal. The Pershing had proved it. And the war, though not yet finished, had shifted forever.